Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, July 4th weekend extended. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives over at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, what do you do over at the old college?
I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the college.
We hope that you're having a festive time. All of this made possible through Mercy College of Health Sciences, who underwrites our show. Thank you for Mercy College for doing so. mchs.edu.
Yeah, this time of year, your mind naturally turns to the history of our country and the contributions of religious orders like the Sisters of Mercy. And you know what, the first sisters that arrived to this land gave up a lot and leaving their homeland. And I think, you know, a distinctive mark on Des Moines as a city, even to this day, when you drive by downtown, you see Mercy One Hospital. And of course, the college were right there as well. What a testament to their sacrifice.
Have you ever noticed when you're driving in Ankeny that there's Ora et Labora Road? No, Ora Labora Road.
I have noticed.
And so
yeah.
Ora et Labora is, of course, the Benedictines motto. So pray and work.
Yeah.
So I don't know of any, I don't know if this is one of the weird French influences. I don't know of any sort of Benedictines that threw down roots here or anything like that. So I didn't know. You live slightly more north towards that way than me. I didn't know if you ever ran into an explanation of that.
I'm intrigued by it. Sometimes I do a little bit of digging, though, and I'm disappointed. You know, like you find out it was someone's favorite beer or they stumbled upon the phrase online or something, but that'd be interesting. If there is, we need to figure that out. We should have Mark Sheevy on the show.
He might know. And so pointing to that out, like Des Moines, right? I think I was under the impression that meant the monks. So I was like, oh, the monks. Wow. But it actually means literally the Moine. And like Moine is a French word that the Spanish, I think, used as some sort of shorthand. So the point being is it has nothing to do with monks. So it is a bit disappointing. So I'm worried that, like you said, Ora et Labora is someone read Latin and misunderstood it or something.
I don't know about Des Moines proper, but I think some of the French names that are scattered throughout the Midwest are there because of the Jesuits passing through this area.
Oh, absolutely. So that was what I was thinking. So then we got, I don't think the Jesuits were going to call something the monks, right?
That's right.
That's that's asking like Cardinals fans to call something the Cubs. That's probably not going to happen.
Bridge too far.
A bridge too far. Well, it is 4th of July weekend, like we said. We hope people were able to spend time with families, with friends, able to celebrate being members of the United States, that the history that we're all a part of. We're going to be talking about memory today, and about the narratives that allow us to remember. I'm just warning all of you guys out there in listener land, though. I've done this a few times with Bud where I don't pre-warn him about what we're going to talk about. And so there might be fireworks, but that's also the theme. There might be fireworks, you responding to the ideas I'm going to throw out there. So do you feel prepared to put on the show appropriate for this weekend?
I'm a little nervous, but, I'll do my best. The promise of fireworks is, I think, intriguing.
There we go.
This is the kind of episode where we need some sound effects on the soundboard. No.
That's the best I got.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we might be able to put in some better ones. I'll see if I can find some fireworks. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, no matter how it is you are listening in, whether that be on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network through the airwaves, on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or on the podcast. We are grateful for our listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. So, Bud, 4th of July the festivities did make me think of what we were going to talk about today. But like I said, I wanted it to be a surprise. So, my first question to you is, have you seen that, what I think is pretty hilarious, meme, statement, tweet, whatever it might be, where it says somewhere in the United States, so like imagine it's July 3rd. Somewhere in the United States, there's an American spending their last day with all 10 fingers.
Yeah.
Have you seen that
that's
one?
That's good.
Okay. So good joke, right? Again, if you're still shooting off fireworks, be safe. But good joke, quality joke. What's interesting is there's a lot of actual little statements like this, and the internet, I think, has multiplied these, where there's this idea of people not realizing something is the last time they've done X at the time of it happening. Now, some of these are meant to pull at your heartstrings. Like I saw one the other day that goes, at one point there was the last time that your kid fell asleep in the car seat and you carried them into their bed. And so you're like, oh man, that makes you like feel like an old person. Or like, yeah, you can think back to your own childhood. There was the last time you and your friends played on a playground for the last time.
Yeah, because when you're going through those experiences, it feels like they'll extend out forever. And then all of a sudden, like, you blink.
Yep.
And your kid's walking or...
Now, there's also positive versions of this. So there, somewhere there's an alcoholic or a drug user who took the last sip of alcohol or took the last hit, right? So filled with a lot of hope that at the time that's happening, they don't think that there's a tomorrow where that doesn't happen, but here they are all those years later, and they've not gone back. I think about it with the 4th of July, bud, right? So there was a day when that was the last day the Americans considered themselves to be a colony of Britain. So we keep going, right? There's all these ideas that there's the last day you are something, and at the time, as you pointed out, it's nearly impossible for us to notice it. Now, this is weird, bud, because how many times in your life, if we've expressed anxieties or just if you've talked about, maybe dealing with like worries about the future or, sort of reconsidering the past, that people said, you need to live in the present. You hear that every so often?
Yes.
So on just this level, let's start at the level of fun memes on the internet. It's really not completely possible, at least in some aspects of our life, to live in the present. Because it would be, so like, let's take the kids on the playground. How would it ever occur to someone, like especially a kid, to go, this is the last time we're all going to play together? It takes the sort of foresight that would be impossible for a child in that moment to notice.
Yeah.
It's certainly the case that things like even the positive ones, this is going to be my last drink of alcohol and I'm not going to drink ever again. That's sort of the thing with when you're dealing with addictions is how many times have you said that? And then one time it finally took. We can say this about sins, et cetera, et cetera. So there's one way, Bud, that you agree that you're going on air and you're officially agreeing with me that we can't live in the present. How does that sound just as an initial statement?
It sounds good. The one angle that I would push back on is like if you're on the playground and thinking about like this is the last time we could be together, in some sense you're not living in the present.
Absolutely.
Because you're like to live in the present is sort of to rest in that moment. Well, that's tracking with what you're saying.
So I'm going to argue. So like let's that's a great point. What's funny is to be aware of this. Yeah. Like if you're too hyper aware about this fact, then you'll never live in the present.
You'd be crushed by a kind of anxiety of like life slipping through your fingers like sand in a time glass.
Yeah, it's sort of like the
hourglass.
The soap opera sands of the or whatever time of our life, sands of the moment, whatever. Yes. Okay, but I'm going to push this further. It's actually the case that biophysically we can't live in the present. So on one hand, right, just sort of the synapses of your neurons, any sort of input you get from the outside world, by the time it reaches your brain and you consciously experience it, it's in the past. To such an extent that actually when you look out in your visual field, things that are further away are actually further in the past because it took, even though it was a little bit, Bud, it took that light and that sound more time to reach you than what was close by.
You sound like a modern day St. Augustine. Do you remember when we did the Confessions? He's got this whole meditation on what is time.
What is time? So,
and he sort of he lands in a place where he says like the present is really hard to pin down. Like the past is as the recollection of things that have happened. The future is something that we can conceptualize, but the present is gone almost the moment we consider it.
Well, and so this is good. This is what I kept pushing for is so when people go, hey, if you're not going to have any anxiety, like you said, you need to live in the moment. But then you start to go, Well, not only can we not live in the moment, because if we try too hard, we will make it where we won't live in the moment. Yeah. And then when we consider biologically, we might not be able to literally be in the moment. Then we start to think of, another fun July 4th thing, a T-shirt that I want to buy. Have you seen that one that goes, "The British blew a 13-colony lead"?
Yeah, and I chuckle. Is it a reference to, is there a specific, sporting event or game that happened?
I think it's the Atlanta Falcons.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Yeah. Excuse me. But the idea, right, is think about how in some ways we can only live in a moment once it's past and we re-narrate it. Yeah. There's a way in which, so we talk about memory, right? We remember, we put it back together. We represent it. We represent it to our senses. So in an even weirder way, the only way to live in the moment, I only think there's two. The first one is actually through story and recollection, which is why it's important on July 4th, right, that we have these annual ritualized holidays where we remember what happened. This makes sense to me, Bud, of course, with the liturgy. Yeah. What do we call it when we talk about do this in memory of me? The anamnesis.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And so
I thought that was a rhetorical question.
Right. And so anamnesis is sort of like amnesia, right? Which is, so in some ways, anamnesis, like the do this in memory of me, is sort of the official, we will not forget. In remembering it, we make it present again. So there's a way in which we really only enjoy the present by recalling it after it's gone. But I do think there's one other way in which we can totally live in the present. But I think it throws a huge wrench in the gears of how most people talk about it. So what is the only thing that's actually present in the present fully without it being in any way marked by a passage of time at all? And that's eternity. Oh. So eternity is present in the moment more than we ever could be. But I actually think being present in the moment is not like a default position and we just get busy and we forget how to do it. I do think kids get the closest naturally acting that way, which is why we must be like little children to enter the kingdom of God. But I actually think being present in the moment is a mystical achievement that is hard to do. And that's why something like Saint Benedict, again, to bring him up, in his life, Gregory the Great goes on and on about he was present in himself. And that's something that he achieved after all these years of being a hermit and then a monk. So on one hand, I want to give some of us a break when we're told we need to live in the moment. I actually think that's much harder to do. Yeah. But I think it's important for us to realize that the only way we can actually live in a moment, one of them is by remembering the past and making it present in things like story or in the liturgy. But I think there's a real way, Bud, that the only way we live in the present moment is mystically by connecting inwardly to the eternal moment of God and then living in our moment through God's eternity and not our temporal experience of it.
Well, that's a fascinating suggestion, because as you were talking at the end there, I was thinking about the affirmation that I've heard some theologians give that our Lord experienced the beatific vision from the very moment of his conception. So you mentioned saints like Saint Benedict, who achieved this kind of rootedness in the eternal now. And that was sort of like the outcome of a spiritual journey. Christ had said that, because he was fully divine and united with the Father, that he experienced the beatific vision from the very beginning of his life. And if I'm tracking with you, like a way you could say that is like Christ was always like in the moment. And I think that shines a light on a lot of his encounters and a lot of his works, because it's like even in his sort of like mundane encounters, like that would be mundane for us, like a conversation at a well,
right,
are transformed by the sort of eternal perspective that our Lord brings to it.
Well, then one of the things that I'm hoping for, there's a few more forks in the road I want to bring up to this.
Okay.
But one of them is, I think there's a presumption that we complicate our anxieties are almost always because we're complicating things, right? So like, hey, dude, stop worrying about the future. Stop reconsidering the past. That living in the moment's like, let it be, bro, like the Beatles say, or just hang loose or something like this. I think the first important step for folks to truly try to live, to be present in the moment, to be present to others, is to stop acting like it's easy.
Yeah.
So do you get that impression that people imply that living in the moment is easy. And have you ever experienced that as like an occasion to beat yourself up? Because I know I have.
Oh yeah, they do imply that, and it's sort of, yeah, it's seen as, how do I say it? Like sometimes like it feels like the discourse online, it will kind of cast aspersions on people who are unable to achieve this kind of living in the moment. But on the other hand, so the way we talk about it on a surface level, it makes it seem like sort of something that you're getting wrong if you're not living this out. On the other hand, it feels like friends and people in our culture generally spend a lot of money and time trying to achieve this. And so, the kind of folks who I hear talking about this sort of thing sometimes on social media are the same ones who are like sort of broadcasting the great trip that they recently took. Not to bemoan them of that, but like, it's sort of like it took a 7-hour flight to a beach before they could get into the moment.
Oh, okay. This is great. And so this is proof, people, you just have to take my word for it. I really, truly have surprised Bud completely by this. And so this goes to show we're on the same wavelength. We're living in the same moment. Because the money you can make trying to compel people to feel guilty that they're not pulling this off and actually implying that it's easy is a way to market what I would say are ineffective means to actually getting to this presence that can only be attained through eternity. So on one hand, the easy ones I think most people see through is this idea to make you feel like your normal day life is trash. And the only way you're going to get to the present moment is, like you said, hop on a plane and go to somewhere expensive and spend money. And lucky for you, you found the person on Instagram that's going to help you, do that.
Yeah.
But I would say slightly more insidious, although almost always good-willed. I'll argue that there's a lot of sort of, with the marketers of like, you need to go somewhere else in order to find this living in the present moment. I'm not going to say it's, twisted or evil, but certainly it's vested interest. The second one I think is legitimately people trying to help, but they don't see how it's the same sort of market principle that drives it. And Bud, just to take it on, folks, I see this all the time with the mindfulness movement.
Yeah.
Now, there's two things to this. On one hand, mindfulness seems to always show up where people want you to work harder for them. And they don't want you to get burnt out, which to me already is morally problematic language, because that makes it sound like you're a machine that should be, replaced or conditioned and not a human with, a holistic reality for flourishing. But I'll say this, that this really does get to this idea of like, okay, well, we're going to try to like squeeze more work out of you. But the second thing is it confuses a means for an end. So on one hand, let me praise what is good and why I think some people really do track with mindfulness. Look, being trained or helped or guided to have intentional attention is certainly something in our day and age that's very helpful. So when they play calm music and they say, okay, pay attention to your breathing, pay attention to your body, or whatever they're doing, they are helping something that's hard in our day and age, which is intentional attention, not just waiting for something like a marketer or like a commercial or a TV show to catch your eye, intentional attention. But they kind of leave it there. And this idea, right, that if we could just be mindful and pay attention to the moment, we'll be in it, falls prey to all of the things that we started to talk about. There's a way in which trying to pay attention to attention will get you so far into your head, you'll never live in the moment. Yeah. But besides that, it leaves you in the attention of our sensory, even if it's like sixth sense or interior senses, which I'm not like totally like dismissing, but unless you're thinking of something completely wacko, I'm dismissing that. But the idea is like, okay, I understand, but because it won't jump into the reality of that there's an eternal aspect to our interiority, that as you pointed out with Augustine, that God is more interior to ourselves than we are to ourselves. I think mindfulness will never achieve what it's getting at, which is why you'll always have to buy books and go to right? If that's the thing with marketing, but if you can find something that almost works but never completely does, guess what you're going to have to do for the rest of your life? Sign up for what that is.
Yeah.
Now, I'll say this too, just to like, so it's like we're not, like we're not being self-critical. I think when religion is sold as sort of a narcotic in the same way, it's actually, it's abusing religion, it's utilitizing religion, But when religion tries to act like, well, it's going to be the solution to your problems, so it does the same thing, right? It's like addictive. You have to keep doing it. Presumably, bud, if you had one true moment where mystically you were unified to eternity and were truly present in the moment through eternity, once would suffice. It would be enough to get you through till glory. But that's why I think it's so hard and why it's so easy to miss what's actually being said.
Yeah, I hope I don't take us too far afield, but I've actually thought a lot about this topic recently. I think I shared on air that around Thanksgiving last year, I had a little blood pressure scare. And so part of my response to that experience was actually practicing mindfulness. And I did some things that like we've sort of sideways critiqued on the show. Like I paid for an annual subscription to an app that is supposed to help you in this respect. But it caused me to reflect on this quite a bit, to see how sometimes like it's pushed like in corporate context and what might be the motivation there. Speaking sort of forthrightly, I found it helpful. It in a sense like did help me sometimes too. I don't know if unwind is the right word, but like sort of settle down. But it's interesting because I think the app that I use, it's not like, I don't feel like it's not like explicitly religious, but it's drawing on, I'm pretty sure, more like Buddhist practices. And so the basic element of like this mindfulness is to stop, to slow down, to pay attention to your breathing. And then if like thoughts into your mind, to try to come back to just attentiveness to your breathing. And I think there are different techniques that you can use, but the sort of like intentionality around like awareness around your breathing is really meant to kind of like stop the internal narrative, the internal monologue that kind of, you could say, plagues all of us. I say plagues all of us because like to be human is to have that kind of internal monologue, to have that sort of like language game happening in your mind space. But it can get carried away. Like the train can start going on down the tracks in an unhelpful direction. And so mindfulness is supposed to like stop those occasions. But I came across recently some commentary from Joseph Ratzinger around this. And he says, in some Christian circles today, there's a kind of movement to incorporate these things. And it's because there's sort of like a pragmatism to them in that they're really rooted in like longstanding, in a lot of cases, monastic traditions from other parts of the world and things. But Ratzinger cautioned, he said, like there is definitely, without doubt, like a history and a tradition of meditation, especially in Christian religious life. But he said like it does take on a different form in that as Christians, when we pray and when we meditate, it's always an encounter with a person. It's not really ultimately about stilling your thoughts or silencing your thoughts. And this kind of ties into what I think you're saying a bit, in that there's something how am I saying it? Like we can't restrain God. And so I think about in the Old Testament, the different figures who have an encounter with the living God. And a lot of times that pushes them in a direction they're not ready for. Like, go to the land that I will show you. God doesn't tell Abraham where exactly he's going to take him. He says, follow me. Similarly, like Moses, I think what God asked, like they're all being kind of drawn out of a comfortable place. And so meditation, like in the more popular form as it's been presented to me, is sort of like ultimately self-help, where being called to this eternal now, it does provide a kind of peace, but it can unsettle like our daily life.
And I want to say that to begin with, I think just like it would be like crazy to be like, you're stretching or you're doing jumping jacks, you don't believe enough in God. But what I think is happening is people going like, hey, you know how like if you do jumping jacks and stretch, your body gets stronger? Well, that's because like it's prayer or it's close to prayer. It would be a similar thing. I think it makes sense to go, hey, I have racing thoughts, and then I have a biophysical response, and someone goes, hey, this sort of mindfulness like helps stop that bio-neurological response. Power to you. That's awesome. But that is physical, right? It's actually, to me, much more like exercise than it is saying that you're living in the moment. In fact, there's some ways in which it's asking you not to live in the moment, because the moment is your brain's going nuts and you're trying to like reset it. So I think that to say that there's useful things, there's means to ends that help us with biophysical response, and that our body and its well-being and its flourishing has something to do with our spiritual lives and our inward life. Absolutely. Inwardness has to have a sort of connection to the body because of the incarnation. However, I think, and it seems like I'm being pedantic, but it's a small point that it's a big one. That is not living in the moment. I actually think living in the moment is very difficult, and when we accept that, we start to be truthful about the spiritual life, and I think we start to get closer to being truly in depth with spiritual life. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, whether that be over the airwaves on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network, iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or over podcast. We are grateful for you to be listening. We hope everyone had a fun and safe 4th of July itself, but we hope that the weekend festivities are treating you well as well. Said well twice, now 3 times. But the point being is we're glad that you're with us, and thank you for listening to the show. We've been talking about trying to live in the present moment and how it is impossible. Well, technically, or almost impossible, except through God. A brief recap, I guess, so we can keep the conversation going. A lot of people tell you you need to learn to live in the present moment because living in the past makes you nostalgic or bitter. Living into the future makes you anxious. But living in the present turns out to be very hard. Biophysically, we actually don't. All of our experiences are mediated at least by some passage of time, even at the nano or microsecond level. When it comes to really trying to live in the moment, if we obsess with living in the moment, we won't because we'll be in our heads. There's a way in which we only truly appreciate the moment after it's passed, and we re-narrate it, remember it, make it re-present by representing it in our memories or things like liturgies and rituals, which makes sense talking about that 4th of July weekend. But religiously, what we were really trying to say is the only way to be truly present in the present moment is through eternity. Eternity, which is present in all moments of time because it is not a duration of time. It is the ever-present reality of existence that God himself lives in every moment and makes all moments possible. So it's through our interiority, when we have an inner life with God, that we are able to enter into all times, actually, but specifically the present moment. Without God, without theology, without this mystical union, we will get close to living in the present moment, like if we act like little children, which that's why Jesus says to enter into the kingdom of heaven, you must be like a little child. However, we will not perfectly be able to do that, except that we go on a journey inside ourselves to unify with God, at least in some way, and then and only then will we live in the present moment through eternity. Now, Bud, I was throwing that out because I think it's important. For one hand, I hope people don't hear this as too negative. I hope this lets people off the hook, because the more I get into being a dad or having a lot on my plate because of work or the responsibilities of the world, the more I hear people say you have to live in the present moment or you're gonna worry yourself to death. You're gonna miss things as they happen. And so to me, it's sort of a directive that I'm told, and like we've said before in the first half, is sometimes represented as our default look, and just if we would, relax or chill out, we'll get to it. I think it's important to say that for Christians, it is difficult to do. Now, we've talked about the worrisome nature about how people make money off of this fact. We talked about mindfulness, what it is good and what it isn't good at and what it's good for. And I really appreciate you being vulnerable and talking about things you've been going through your life, about where it's been effective, but where it misses this point. But for me, this gets down to talking about what it is that the modern world makes difficult for Christian practice. And on one hand, I do think Christianity, particularly religion in general, starts to become one more way that we try to live too much in the past or the future, or that we try to avoid all of those things by, getting close, approximate to these realities, by trying to consume them or buy them or things like this, and it not quite working. But part of this is we want to live with God, we want to speak with God, we want to be unified with God. But if we have an improper understanding about where we get to God in our world, it's no wonder that he can seem cold or unloving or unapproachable. And I think that this starts to be a very practical question, Bud, is if people keep hearing they need to live in the present moment, practice the presence of God and things like this, but it doesn't seem easy and they think it should be, this might be something that drives them away from the pursuit of that inner life that's so important to us.
Yeah, your whole idea for the show today, it really sparked for me some reflection on even the concept of memory. So you started with those memes around, maybe this is the last time you'll, like, the 4th of July one is having 10 fingers, but the more sentimental ones and things like that. And when you first shared that, I thought about the disciples, and not the day before the crucifixion, but the day before their first encounter with the risen Christ, and what sort of mental shift took place for them by encountering the risen Lord. Mm-hmm. And in such a way that they actually went back and re-narrated their experience. So they had all these experiences with Jesus and things he had said to them, but they didn't make sense, or they made sense in a new light once they knew he had conquered death. And then the ongoing kind of, there's a theologian who calls this the intelligence of the victim. Like, once they lived into that sort of like being framed as the scapegoat, or having an allegiance to him, and then realizing that that's not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one, that transformed their vision. And then for us as Christians, we walk through that experience through being embedded in the liturgy. So the liturgy is, like you said, the anamnesis. It's the choosing not to forget. It's the remembering. And remembering there can take on the connotations of memory, but also of like our membership in the body of Christ. And so that's how like our vista is expanded. And it runs against the grain of, in our day and age, we tend to think about all of those realities like identity and memory in a very individualistic way. We're post-Cartesian. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Mm-hmm. And so we think of memory as sort of like the storehouse of our brain. And I'll go into my internal database and I'll pull out thoughts where really our identity is only encountered through our relationship with other people. First, usually for most human beings, through their relationship with their mother. And they realize in this encounter with another person that they are their own situated self. And sometimes we forget that as life goes on, that we still exist in those relationships.
The reflexive self.
Yeah, even memory, it's not really like an individually situated storehouse. It's a community, and it's individuals drawing upon that sort of communal experience. That's where, we could get into a really interesting sort of bunny trail around even like the conversation around digital media. Mm-hmm. And sometimes Catholics tend to focus on like the negative kind of like impact of that reality. On the other hand, it's been a medium in which a lot of younger Catholics have encountered, great aspects of the tradition. And in some ways, it can take on a liturgical function. I think the liturgy is like a daily, weekly practice calling to mind important realities that we're prone to forget.
Oh, and what I tell people when I say what I think the digital does well and examples of the digital doing something right and good that we should appreciate, one, I often say, is don't think about the front of a Wikipedia page, but think about the back and how all of those hyperlinks link and connect to other things, which is marvelous when you think about. But the other one is actually, it used to be called Time Hop, but I think on Facebook it's now just you have a memory from the past. And so Bud this year has been two sort of memories have started to float through. One is when we were in St. Louis for Mary Marr's baptism. So like that's a wonderful thing to remember because we're her godparents. But also just a few weeks ago, we were reminded that Stella went in to have a surgery when she was really little that was really life-changing and made her health a lot better. And that sort of reminder, right? Remember, and it wasn't just a matter of like, oh, I made a funny post. Some of those posts are like that, and I'm like, man, I was good back then. But a lot of them are, oh my goodness, it's so great to like show my now teenage children, this is you as a little baby. We were so worried about you. Yeah. So I think those are things that are important. And this gets back to, like you said, the ability to narrate to our children and ourselves, right? Like when that's happening, when your kids are just going through stuff, you are just in survival mode. But to think about how, no, this sort of planning we had to do to make Stella feel better, and now reflecting on that, 15, 16 years later, it really is this sort of anamnesis. It makes us remember the story in a totally different way with new meanings. And again, that's why I love this idea that you pointed out. The very interesting remarks in the gospel when it will say something to the effect of the disciples didn't understand it at that moment, but thought about this afterwards. And multiple gospel writers will interrupt the sort of course of the narrative to quote unquote break the fourth wall or get meta. You know, they didn't even have that concept, but that was the sort of precursor of that, to say, listen, when this happened, you need to know they barely got what was going on. But with the resurrection, right, the fullness of the story, it all made sense. This goes back to something like the Markan secret, right? That Jesus in the Gospel of Mark keeps saying, don't tell people yet, don't tell people yet, don't tell people yet. Why not? Because you're not going to get even the healing narratives unless you see the cross and the resurrection. And to me, Bud, that is something that the digital world provides us a map to see better than maybe we ever have in the past.
Well, so much of human culture is revolves around our conceptualization of time, I think. And, you know, it's funny, this is a silly example, but so when I talk about human culture, I'll get to the example in a moment, but like you think about cultures that have thought about time in a cyclical manner and sort of like the series of events, like it follows this pattern and then repeats itself, and how different that is from like the apocalyptic mindset of Christianity. I think in today's world, like if we talk about a new kind of paganism, it's not even cyclical so much as it's kind of like drudgery, and life is sort of like this ongoing kind of dragging on of time that's kind of punctuated by, I mean, sometimes like hedonism or things, but the
news cycle.
Yeah. My silly example is when I think about how we mark time, like sometimes I'll need like Facebook to jog my memory about what are truly important events like a baptism. But if you ask me about a Husker football game, like when Nebraska defeated Michigan State 31-21 in 2014 or something, I can usually tell you what's going on that day. Like just the fact that it's tied together with this thing that I really enjoy, it just really stands out in my mind. But I mean, from that silly example, I think we can draw a more serious kind of consideration in that how do we organize our time? And if memory is so strongly connected to ritual, because I think sports takes on a ritual form, like what kind of role can that play? It's, you know, fulfilling your weekly obligation at Mass is foundational and essential. But as families and as communities, what else are we doing beyond that?
Well, look, a negative example, because I don't want people to get this idea that like I love everything about the internet and everything digital is great. So if you'll remember the first sort of volley against the Ptolemaic universe, so that's where like the Earth is the middle of the universe and everything rotates around it, and people were starting to go like, "No, man, it's the sun." So the first sort of response was this very technical sort of mathematical model where all of the planets had things called epicycles, and this was supposed to like account for the fact that they would move in a line, but then they'd move retrograde, where it looked like they went backwards, and then they would go forward. Now, if this makes sense, right? If you are not the middle of the solar system, but since they were like, no, we're the middle of the solar system, so what happens is you have these things that move, but then they also have their own epicycles. But I think epicycles is a great way to talk about trends on the internet that sort of take over the internet, and that we really do mark time in this sort of pagan way where it's just this endless news cycle. And so what happens is this epicycle within cycles where you go, some event happens, then we memeify it, and then that meme makes the rounds, and like everybody talks about everything through the sort of auspice of this meme, and then it goes away. And so I was talking about this with my wife and daughter about the meme with the dog in the house with everything on fire saying this is fine. Yeah. And what's funny is if you wanted to do the research, you could go back to when that first showed up on the internet. And like you said, I would probably remember a lot of the events going on because I'm like, oh, I remember when I saw that stupid meme. But now, Bud, it's almost the case that you don't like an event in the news hasn't truly happened until the dog in the firehouse saying this is fine has had that news event superimposed on it. And so it is sort of like pagan epicycles through trends. viral trends now sort of mark our cyclical time. And Bud, that's terrifying. That's all there is in the future, right? Is like the sort of cycle of irony. It's no wonder people are afraid of the digital world, because that's what sort of makes the headlines instead of this deeper, real sense of anamnesis, remembering, recalling, etc.
Yeah, I like some good irony myself. I'm prone to cynicism on certain occasions, but the ironic bent of like the generations under us can sometimes be frightening to me. I don't have a good example off the top of my head. To get back to sort of the topic at hand, I think with what you're saying, it's kind of an evangelistic moment. Like, sometimes personalities like mine sort of flee from conflict. And so you see these hotly debated topics in the news cycle and you sort of want to flee from them. I'm thinking about the kind of discourse that sometimes will crop up around like athletes not standing for the national anthem. You begin to see where the few areas in which our culture continues to mark time, like holidays, or patriotic displays and things like that, they become contested ground because really you're communicating something by how you relate to them. And I don't want to get too far down that bunny trail today, but I think as Christians we've got opportunities. We've talked about this on the show before, whether it's Halloween, the 4th of July, whatever it happens to be, Thanksgiving, to say, it's kind of like when St. Paul goes to the Areopagus. Like, I see this statue you have to the unknown God, and he uses that as a starting point. Like, that's a good impulse, and then says, like, the true, like the living God is not made in houses built by human hands, but he's the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And so, like, again, this isn't really the theme for the show today, but like this weekend, you're going to be around friends and family members and community, like neighbors and things like that, who have these patriotic impulses, or maybe you have a friend who's, like he's the naysayer who wants to critique them. Those are an opportunity for Christians to talk about like the true meaning of time and the true direction of history. Oh,
I love this. And so I'm probably not doing Soren Kierkegaard completely fair. And I know most people out there probably don't even know what I'm talking about. I'm just anybody who's a philosophy dork. I realize that I'm taking from everyone's favorite Dane and tweaking it a bit. But here I go. It has to do with irony. It ends with talking about Jesus. So it's going to be good, bud. There is certainly nihilistic irony, or let's just say irony that's sort of about giving up, or that nothing matters. And the thing that I want to throw out is when people act like all irony is bad, is irony is definitively human, and it has everything to do, Bud, with this fact that we don't quite live in the present. So what is irony, Bud? It's not what Alanis Morissette says. It's not just when silly things or coincidences happen. It's when characters, I mean, the most basic form, right, is characters in some sort of work operate with knowledge without knowledge that the reader has. It's the most basic form, right? So we're reading the book and we know that what's going to happen to this person, but they don't. And so they say something ironic, which means if they knew, they would say something quite different. All forms of irony, from sarcasm to deep sort of philosophical irony, stems from this fact, the disparity of knowledge in some way. So nihilistic irony says, none of us know, it's not worth trying, give up. And meme culture in this sort of like torrent of epicycles plays into this. There is no meaning. You're never going to understand. You can only mock. Okay. However, before we get to sort of Christian irony, let's talk about Socratic irony. So Socrates, right, meant to be ironic because what did he say, Bud? I am wise because I know I don't know. And by being willing to sort of place irony on himself, he was able to start grasping at meaning, at reality. And ultimately, God, even though he's the sort of embodiment of philosophy going as far as it can without theology. Christian irony is the fact that in the incarnation, eternity now walks paradoxically in time. Jesus is ironic, not because he's nihilistic, but because that disparity is now turned on its head, and eternity sort of rips the world inside out and makes all things new. That which can never change has made things new. The irony of the cross, right? And so there's one way, Bud, where irony meme culture is like one of my favorite things, and I think is actually very medieval, if it doesn't fall into the epicycle of nihilistic irony. I think that we have a chance to bridge a lot of gaps with sort of people who are more along the Socratic irony line. Like, they like this sort of meme culture because they know that the powers and principalities aren't who they say they are. And the Socratic irony points to this. It's a very fertile ground to evangelize with Christian irony, that you're right, you need to go all the way through, down and through, right? Not to stay in nihilistic irony, but to pass through to the irony of the cross. So, Bud, this is where I'm going to end because we're running out of time. So Aristotle has long said that poetry is closer to philosophy than history, because history is about the sort of mere drudgery of time going on, but poetry tries to ask what is eternal about any moment of truth. And so I know that we mean history a lot different than the Greeks did, but I certainly think that this is one way to think really well about Christianity, that just like Jesus Christ is the Word made flesh, the incarnation is history made poetry. So finally, the vagaries of history now have poetic, philosophic, deep, long-lasting, eternal memory. And Bud, that's what I think I'm driving at, and what I threw out that you answered so well. And thank you for being willing to go on this insane venture with me today. But that's what I think it is that our present moment can become poetic, speaking to the eternal truths. But first, we have to approach eternity that is within us, within everyone, the Imago Dei, within persons, either through that communal memory or through the inner life that we have. And once we have that sort of unification with eternity, then we can live in the present moment and not the opposite way. And then even the moments of our lives that are quote-unquote mere history will be elevated to the poetic, to the enduring symbolic truth that can never end, that can never die, and lives with God. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Wonderful to have you with us. Bud, again, thank you for humoring me. I know sometimes when I go, just trust me, it might seem like I'm walking you out on a tightrope, but you always respond so well. And I will treasure particularly this episode because it certainly was things I was working through. It's wonderful to have you be willing to work through the zaniness with me.
Well, you promised some fireworks, and that episode reminded me of a pop bottle rocket. When we lit it, I didn't know where it was going to head, but it screamed off into the horizon, and I think had a nice ending.
It didn't hit like a van with shag carpeting and catch on fire.
I don't think my neighbors appreciate bottle rockets, but I am one of those folks who I only try to light between the 12-hour window of like 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. on the 4th of July.
You are a responsible citizen, and Ben Franklin had people like you just in mind.
Well, I hope no Windsor Heights police officer is listening to this episode.
That's right.
No, they do seem to look past the lighting of fireworks on Independence
Well, you're in
Day.
Windsor Heights, so like life, like it's the Wild West, man.
Oh, how so?
I think that's only Des Moines, right?
No, we're not supposed to there either.
Okay.
And they run a pretty tight ship if you've ever tried to speed through Windsor Heights.
No comment.
So if your conscience is bearing the weight of a recent speeding ticket, or if you just want to join in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio, we pray the rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. But you can also access the app, Iowa Catholic Radio app, to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
And we ran long with this episode because we're having such a good conversation. So I won't go completely into the events that are coming up, but it's easy for you to do so. iowacatholicradio.com, do the events page. Obvious things coming up like the fair in August. We got Christ Our Life coming up September. There's all sorts of stuff you want to check out. So iowacatholicradio.com, the events page, to find those out. As always, just want to point out that this ministry is not simply the people behind the microphones, behind the boards, or behind the desk. It's your ministry as well. It's not possible that we do things like The Uncommon Good, the local shows, or even the national feed without your help. It only happens because of your volunteering, of your time, talent, and treasure. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your time. But really, thank you for your treasures. Please consider donating to Iowa Catholic Radio. You can do that at 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150. Either talk or text, or go to iowacatholicradio.com and hit the donate button. That is what makes it possible. Thank you for all of the volunteers do for our show. Bud, once again, happy July 4th weekend. fantastic show. Thanks for your recollection.
Yeah, thanks, Bo.
This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.